and welcome to Fiction Fans, a podcast where we read books and other words too. I'm Lily.
And I'm Sarah, and I'm so thrilled to welcome Claire North onto the podcast to talk about her excellent Odyssey retelling, Ithaca.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here.
It is our pleasure. I cannot stress how much I love this book. I loved it so much.
I beam in an auditory way.
We have to restrain ourselves for a couple minutes, though, because first I would like to know what's something great that happened recently.
So I'm going to level with you. It's been quite a tough week. And so I was racking my brains, kind of going, what can I pick out of what's been quite a difficult week? And I think the highlight of the last kind of 7 days or so was roughly this time last weekend, I went to a thing called a repair cafe, which is run by my local council. And it's where you can turn up with your broken stuff and for free, a bunch of experts will try and fix it, which I love as an eco nerd because I'm like, right to repair is really important. And it's just quite a nice vibe. Like it's like lots of people sat there with their broken toasters and broken kettles and kind of going, it would be nice to have this thing live again. And I went along with a CD player and unfortunately they couldn't fix it, but at least it's modular, so I might have a chance in the future. But while waiting in the queue, there was a lady with a broken Anglepoise lamp. And I am a lighting engineer when I'm not doing books. And I was like, well, it's quite a long queue, nothing better to do with my time, so might as well fix that. And just spent a lovely half hour fixing a random stranger's lamp. And it felt great. It felt like the perfect combination of like my skill set at a really low level. Like, you know, when you're asked to use your skills and like, this is an easy test, thank goodness. But also just a nice way to chat with people while doing something that felt useful. I came away from that with a proper like smug buzz.
That's awesome.
I love that.
Similarly, my good thing is that it's Saturday, which means last week is over.
If I'd known the bar for good things was that low, I would have gone with that.
The point is that no matter how bad the week is, there's always something. And sometimes that thing is that it's done. Yours is way better, though.
I think my good thing is I was on dog walk the other day and I was walking. I was about a block behind this little girl and her mother. And the little girl at one point turned around and she shouted, "It's Mr. Squeakers! Mom, it's Mr. Squeakers!"
Which is almost your pug's name.
Almost. So my pug is Mr. Squeak. Mr. Squeakers is close enough. And it was just really sweet.
I love that she's a neighborhood celebrity.
She is a neighborhood celebrity. I think partially for the fact that she's a girl pug and people get kind of confused that I named her Mr. Squeak. I get a lot of comments about that.
Well, good for you.
Mr. Squeak does not conform to your gender dynamics.
Well, what's everyone drinking this lovely day? I'm having, is it called a shrub when you make a mixed drink with vinegar?
A shrub is a fruit vinegar.
Oh, okay.
It's not the mixed drink, but it is the vinegar.
Well, I did use apple cider vinegar, so it kind of counts maybe.
I think technically that's a shrub.
Well, some apple cider vinegar and seltzer water. It's very nice. It's not actually warm enough out for me to want a cold drink, but I'm forcing it to happen.
I have an herbal tea because I'm feeling a little under the weather. So I thought that black tea was probably not the best idea. And it's nice.
Which, you can't just say herbal tea.
I don't remember what kind of tea it is. It's right, herbal. If it was a black tea or like an oolong, I could tell you what tea it was. But I drink this so infrequently that I think it's like some kind of David's get well soon tea.
We're going to guess chamomile and peppermint or some combination thereof then.
Probably, yeah.
All right.
Well, rounding off this very sober Saturday evening, I have a mint tea, which is the emotional equivalent of already being in my pajamas.
I love mint tea. It's just like, I'm just going to have a hug from the inside out.
Exactly. That's exactly it. It's the fluffy slippers of condiments. Is condiment the right word? You get the idea.
Yeah. We get the idea.
And this is actually a book podcast. I know we tricked everybody, but has anyone read anything good lately other than the novel we were about to discuss?
It's been a lot of podcast reading for me, so not a lot of personal reading. Good podcast reading. But since this question is to talk about things not podcast related, I don't actually have an answer this time.
Yeah, me neither.
I'm in the very privileged position of sometimes being sent books to read with the hope that I will give a blurb going, adequate, Claire North. And I will admit, unless I really love something, I tend not to blurb for it. But I've been very, very lucky to have received in the last couple of months 2 books I thought are actually really great. One is Inanna by Emily Wilson, and the other is Perilous Times by Thomas Lee.
Ooh,
and I think they're both imminently out, and they're good.
We're covering Perilous Times on the podcast close to its release date. I don't remember when that is, but I'm super, super, super excited for that one.
Yay! It's fun. It's fun in a kind of angry, urgent, joyful way.
Delightful.
That sounds great, yeah. But today we're going to be talking about Ithaca, which Sarah and I are both huge, Greek mythology nerds. So we're going to try to not go too much on that. We're going to try to hit the right amount.
I am immediately intimidated.
Although I am kind of coming at this from a bad mindset. I'm feeling a little slap happy right now because I had 2 meetings this week where I had to sit through someone going, "Oh, I love the girl power that we're in a meeting with all women." It's made me want to puke a little bit. Which is like a weird vibe to be coming into this conversation about a book that is very heavily about gender dynamics in a very different way. Luckily, no one says girl power in Ithaca.
Yeah, but if we get really angry, if the mint tea goes to our heads, I am very here for conversations about the representation of strong women and the questionable dynamics of feminist retellings, in which what a feminist retelling is women being in the same room as men and going, "Look, there's a man doing something over there." So if we want to talk questionable gender dynamics in literature, I am so up for it.
Okay, good. Because I just wanted to preface that some of my emotions are not coming from this book. I never want to hear the word girl power in my day job, ever. Can we glass ceiling, something, anything else? Anyway, that was a little off topic.
Just a little bit. But so, okay, starting off this conversation about the book and not about your feelings about the words girl power.
I'm not 12. Sorry, I'm done.
I actually started reading this book last summer and I loved it so much. When I first started reading this book, I loved it so much. I went, "Oh my God, the narrative voice here. We have to cover this on the podcast. I can't just read this for personal enjoyment. We have to read it for the podcast." And then I had to sit and not read it until now. And it was very, very hard. All of that to say, can you talk about why you decided to have a god as the narrator for this book, Hera in particular, and how you settled on the narrative voice that you gave her?
Sure. So there's 2 answers to the question of why Hera's narrating Ithaca. The short answer is that I went to my editor and said, "I want to write a geopolitical drama about women trying to run a kingdom while all the men are absent, and I think it should be all politics and stabby." And my editor turned around and said, "But Claire, are you aware that we're a fantasy imprint?" And I was like, oh yeah. Oops. So there was a certain amount of editorial going, "Have you considered adding a centaur?" And I was like, and the middle ground for that was having it narrated by an actual literal divinity. So that was phase 1 of it. Phase 2 of that, goodness, the mint tea has gone to my head. Phase 2 of that is that one of the interesting things about the mythology of that time is that from the Odyssey and the Iliad onwards, we tend not to see many women in the narration. We've had our Medeas, we've had our Atalantas, we have our Penelope, our Helen, and our Clytemnestra, and after that, women sort of vanish from the mythological narrative. And one of the interesting parallels that happens in the archaeology, just to wax a bit archaeological on you, is that around about the time of Mycenaean Greece, which is when Troy happened and the Iliad and the Odyssey are set, there's also a certain amount of archaeological speculation going, well, do we also see a movement away from worshipping of mother goddesses and powerful female figures to worshipping of men, and the shift of the narrative from the role of women as powerful as earth, as sky, as the mother, as this great big bloody force in nature, to being the wife? And to what extent can we say, well, there's a parallel here? There is a shift in how we tell stories about women, from women as powerful figures to being basically entirely absent in a narrative, to just being adjuncts to male figures. And for that reason, I thought it might be quite interesting to have Hera narrate book 1, because she is in many ways the epitome of that transition. She goes from being this powerful mother goddess in the ancient archaeological record to being almost a figure of derision and mockery in later mythological tellings. And so if you're interest in female power and how it's changing and how it's being destroyed and how it's being subverted, she seemed like the right voice to have a very, very big and quite an angry perspective on that. And that was of use to me.
Her voice in this book was just so delightful and heart-wrenching, depending on the page.
Yes.
I am delighted to hear that. The plan worked.
Oh my gosh. The way that you used, like, most of the tone of the narration was very, I would say, like, formal language, with the occasional punch of some very informal, just hilarious little almost one-liners thrown in there. And something about that combination just made both stand out so much more. It was incredible.
Thank you. There's a lot of our language veers on the edge of anachronism. Some of it, I think, just goes straight into anachronism. But again, I figure with a divine presence, you're sort of allowed to get away with that to a certain extent. So, for example, I go out of my way not to use the word blue in the book because there's not traditionally a word for that in the ancient Greek language of the time. But I'm sort of comfortable with her going, well, the problem right there is you don't have any decent accountancy happening. So there's a fine line. I don't know whether I walk it well, but there is a fine line between engaging in a modern colloquial way while also respecting the reality this is a time where there's no money. Linear B is barely kicking off, and it's certainly not going to be a written language for most people. And balancing kind of the twin expectations of a readership who will, on the one hand, expect almost that formalized sense of the past with a capital P, but at the same time is likely to be carried along by a more colloquial modern voice.
I definitely think you did that very, very well, for what it's worth.
Thank you.
But speaking of things that you didn't include, like the word blue, what kind of research did you end up doing for this book?
I probably did less than I should pretend I did. I have massive imposter syndrome and am scared of real classicists. So obviously I read the Odyssey and the Iliad. I also read the Odyssey because it was useful to have other stuff going down that was of service to the narrative. And I did your standard many, many hours on the internet reading as much as I possibly could about Mycenaean Greece. And I was very lucky that at the time the British Museum also had a massive Mycenaean exhibition on. And so I remember going to that. I think I went twice, actually. And the first time I went, I remember coming away with this enormous sense of relief that the main thing I took from it is that the archaeological record is quite sparse, which is exactly what you want as a writer. You want to be told we know enough that you can put a few hooks in that might feel familiar, but there's so many question marks that you have a certain liberty and leeway. So yeah.
Yeah, a huge playground to work in.
Big relief.
How much background knowledge, I don't want to say expect, but do you think it would be helpful for a reader to have going into this? Like, should someone have read the Odyssey?
Oh, goodness, no. I hope not. There's many, many pages declaiming on how the son of the guy who knew the brother who went to the place with the guy has now walked into the room. With all due respect to one of the seminal texts that has founded our Western culture as we know it for the last few thousands of years, yeah, fine with the abridged version. And to a certain extent, I hope you don't need to have more than a passing understanding of there's ancient Greece, there was a war in Troy. I genuinely hope that the rest is covered in a tweaked length worth of exposition. I am not working with these texts as sacred objects. I am interested in all the stuff that happens in the gaps in between. One of the reasons I focused on Penelope, particularly the wife of Odysseus, is because she doesn't really appear very much in it. She appears in the Odyssey weeping in her room a fair bit. And that's all we know. There's very little talk of what she does for 20 years while her husband is absent. And it's that great big gap. It's the place where Homer has nothing to say that is a writer's playground for me. I'm not interested in a sacred reverence for a text that has nothing to say, particularly about how did you feed people for 20 years? What do when your husband is off shagging a nymph? Discuss.
I was glad I was taking notes for the podcast for questions, because that meant I also had notes for like all of the different suitors. And it's not your fault that like 5 of them have names that start with an A.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a bit of a hiccup. Homer did slightly screw me over there.
Yeah. I mean, what is it with these old authors and writing names that are the exact same? But I took notes, so it was fine. I also rewatched Troy recently, so I was like, oh yeah, I remember all of that. That ridiculous movie with Brad Pitt. Not a great movie. Very funny, though.
My feelings, I think, have sort of softened over the years. I think You know, when you look back on the things you watched as a 14-year-old and are like, oh, popcorn and fluffy slippers, and you no longer feel quite the same urge to judge it, because then you'd be judging your 14-year-old self. I think that's how I feel about Troy. I think I'm a bit like, well, that happened, didn't it, guys?
Yep.
I'm actually not sure I've ever seen Troy.
They make Patroclus Achilles' nephew or something to try to get around that whole thing. That's why he cared so much, guys. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
So I'll just give you that hint and you can extrapolate the rest.
Okay.
Sean Bean is Odysseus. That's all right.
Yeah,
Sean Bean doesn't die.
The one time. We do know what he has in store for him next, though, don't we?
So we have seen over, I want to say the last decade, 15 years or something, kind of a big explosion of Greek mythology retellings. Do you have any thoughts on why that's been so popular recently, or?
I think there's a fad right now, which I'm very grateful for, because if I can ride that wave, I will be very relieved and happy about that. I think it will probably pass at some point, but right now I am relieved to be part of that. I think my answer comes in two parts. Firstly, coming back to girl power and gender norms, I think there is a genuinely empowering and lovely attempt to reclaim the narratives of the past and the ways in which they've shaped us. For example, if you look at kind of your trifecta of Helen of Troy, Clytemnestra, Penelope, all cousins and sisters, all living at the same time, it's not hard to extrapolate from them female archetypes that have screwed us over for thousands of years. Helen is the flighty bimbo, too pretty to have brains, women must be owned by men, see 50 Shades of Grey. Clytemnestra, ambitious, once powerful, women can't have power, it's too dangerous, see Lady Macbeth, and actually also, arguably, Scarlet Witch. Women can't have power, they're too emotional. And Penelope is the doting, quiet archetype who waits, see all of Charles Dickens. And these are female archetypes that have rippled through our culture for millennia. And I think the active attempt to reclaim and interrogate and own these archetypes and look at them and go, but my dude, what the hell, is good and empowering and important. The slight snag in that, the kind of caveat I'd bring to that, is that some of these attempts, I think, can fall into the bucket of there's a story involving a man, but look, a woman is watching it happen. Some of it can fall into the bucket of oppression narratives. Wasn't it really hard? There's a lot of oppression, women having a really bad time. And through that, I also think it can become quite easy to pat ourselves on the back and going, aren't we doing a radical feminist thing? This is really relevant and modern and exciting and feminist. When actually what we're doing is sort of allowing ourselves to hide behind the label of, well, it was the past, or it was a fantasy, or it was a myth. And the image I sometimes find myself using for this, again, is very pop culture. Imagine I'm going to make this reference referring to kind of like Proust and stuff. But the reference I'm going to use, in fact, is House of the Dragon versus She-Hulk. When House of the Dragon was released, everyone went, my God, what a progressive, exciting, feminist bit of drama. But fundamentally, if you look at it, it's a lot of women suffering, and the power the women own is still fundamentally masculine. And we pat ourselves on the back and go, isn't that progressive and exciting? She-Hulk was released, and it addressed actual conversations about patriarchy and the female experience in the 21st century, and it got review bombed for being woke. And the reason I bring this up is because I think there is a slight safety buffer in talking about feminism and talking about women's stories and talking about how these stories have shaped a female experience when you set it 2,000 years in the past, or even 1,000 years in the past, even 500 years in the past. There is the eternal phrase, isn't there? The past is another country, they do things differently there. I think there can be a slight emotional safety net by putting it in these narrative frameworks, which can be good because at least we're doing it, at least we're questioning these stories, at least we're interrogating them, but can also be, I think, bad in the sense that if you don't then extrapolate that forward to now and look at the stories we still tell ourselves now, then who exactly are we having a dialogue with?
That leads perfectly into my next question about how, on the very surface level of Ithaca, you're dealing with gender dynamics in ancient Greece. However, we do still have this narrator who does kind of walk the line between ancient and modern. And you had it. Did I turn this into a statement instead of a question? Tell us about how you used Hera as a narrator to walk the line between ancient and modern.
I think an omnipotent goddess with no time for this nonsense is always useful. She does not buy into the patriarchy. One of the problems I think you have with any historical retelling that's even remotely accurate whatsoever is that to be a woman in the past, and to a certain extent in the 21st century, to survive socially, you do need to buy into the current social norms. So, for example, the 21st century, before we talk about being empowered, there is still pressure on women to wear the makeup, and, you know, we're described as empathetic and compassionate and sensitive, and men still described as strong and leaders and all of this stuff, toxic gender archetypes that we internalize. And we internalize because they're pervasive, and we internalize and act on them because they allow us to survive. And they're as poisonous for men as they are for women. The useful thing about a goddess is she doesn't have to have any time for that shit. Like, she can see it as the internalized nonsense that it is and has no qualms about calling it out. So that made her very helpful, I think, for just being completely separate from in any way believing in these ideas. The counterpoint to her is the character of Electra, who does turn up and has very much internalized the ideas of what it is to be female in this world. And it's nice that Hera can take one look at her and be like, but dude, what the hell?
Well, we will have some questions about Electra later on in the spoiler section. I don't want to say too much about her just yet. But one of the things that I really appreciated was that you do actually have some like male characters who are not like, it's not just black and white across these gender lines, right? You have these male characters who are empathetic and who do recognize Penelope as more than just a woman weeping in a corner, specifically Medon and Kenamon. And even though, like, yes, they're great, but also seems to me that they could still do better, right? Like,
yeah.
It gives us a counterpoint, right? It's not, oh, men back then were just like that. It's they could have done better. Look, here are two examples of men who were not like that, which means all of the other ones were just not trying hard enough.
I mean, Medon and Kenamon are both bound to a certain extent by the rules of society they live in. But both of them, I think, a bit like Hera, have seen enough of that nonsense to be well over it. They have recognised that the rules are as poisonous for them as they are for everyone else, and are stepping outside of them. Kenamon in particular, as he comes from another culture, is extraordinarily willing to just be like, these ideas you have of how a man should behave are clearly nonsense, and I'm not having any of it. And also I think it was quite important to just, as you say, have that balance and look at how the toxicity of these gender ideas are as poisonous for men as they are for women. A lot of the suitors, while some of them are profoundly unpleasant, they all have come by it fairly honestly. They've come by their unpleasantness through the pressures their fathers put upon them, the pressures their mothers put upon them, the expectations of what it is to be a man, particularly in light of the fact that the Trojan War just has happened. And all the stories of what it is to be a male is based on Achilles and Hector and Agamemnon and all these impossible narrative tales of what masculinity is. And the suitors have been grown up on these. They've been educated on these impossible masculine ideals. And though it has not made them nice people, they've kind of come by being dreadful people in an honest way.
Yes, and you do kind of explore that too with Telemachus and his struggle to be a man in this household.
I think what I loved most about Medon was that he saw Penelope's competency. Like, I don't know, that it's one thing to think men and women are supposed to behave certain ways, but that has just blinded the characters in this book to the extent that they can see that this palace is functioning and not make the connection that that must mean Penelope is doing something. Just that like cognitive dissonance is wild.
I think with Medon, there's a strong theme that runs with most of the Ithacan characters, which is that fundamentally you've got to get the fish in. They're a small island, they need to survive, and when the shit hits the fan, you just have to get over your social prejudices and go, well, how are we going to eat tonight? And I think Medon is the most capable of certainly the elder councillors of looking around the room and going, how are we going to eat? Penelope is going to sort it.
Absolutely.
And she definitely does sort it. So you have written quite a lot. Not all of that has been retellings. You've written lots of original stories. Can you talk a little bit about the differences in your approach to writing a retelling versus writing an original story? Do you have any differences in your approach?
Do I have any differences? Honestly, after 23 years of this, I'm not sure if I have any differences or even if I have a method at this point. It's all just blurred into words. I think there's a slightly different burden of expectation. The easy thing about a retelling is a lot of the narrative legwork is done for you to a certain extent. Though with Penelope, I am exploring stuff that is not talked about in the Odyssey and the Iliad. There is still very strong narrative footnotes. There's clearly Odysseus has been gone for X amount of time. He may or may not return at some point. There are suitors, they are named. There's a lot of the legwork done in terms of the world building already for you. So on the one hand, it's easier. On the other hand, it's harder because you have to walk that fine line between respecting the source material and, more importantly, respecting the reader's expectation of the source material. You can't just radically go around changing the very, very, very well-known plot points. You can't say the Trojan War happened and Troy won, yay, without just going straight into a secondary fantasy world, a what if, which is a very different kettle of fish. So you have to walk a fine line between your own originality and respect to a reader's expectation of the plot. So there's things that are easier, there are things that are harder with that. And again, how you work around the things that are already sort of established to do something that is different enough to justify your and a reader's time, I think is an interesting challenge. I think retellings, they can just be exactly what they say on the cover. They can be a direct retelling of a myth, and some of those are beautiful and fascinating and bring to life a story that otherwise would have been 500 words you read when you were 7 and fleshes it out and makes it whole. But equally, a retelling, I think, can be about who we are now. And that is a complicated tangle to handle well. So I think those are probably the main differences. With my own stuff, when I'm just reading stuff for joy, I'm not worried by that so much. It's, if it doesn't work, that's my problem, not Homer's problem.
We have one more question before we jump into our spoiler section. That's actually for Sarah. Sarah, who should read this book?
If you like Greek mythology, you should read this book. If you are a person, you should read this book. This is one of my favorite books that I've read in quite some time. It's excellent. So I think everyone should read this book, basically.
Yeah, that was an easy question, huh?
Yeah.
Thank you.
To avoid spoilers, skip to 4752.
Okay, so first question, how did you decide how you wanted to break up the story in the trilogy? Because obviously, we know how the Odyssey goes, but you chose specific points to include in book 1, presumably books 2 and 3, which we haven't read yet.
Book 1, I wanted to deal with Clytemnestra because she's interesting. She's a relative of Penelope's, but unlike Penelope, she wielded power obviously. And one of the points of Penelope is she wields power incredibly subtly. She spends all her time pretending to faint and cry while secretly raising an army. Clytemnestra sat on her husband's throne and was like, yo bitches, do what I say. And that is a fascinating difference. And I thought one of the questions you have to ask yourself when dealing with any character is what would screw them over the most? And it seemed to me likely that having a woman turn up on the island who was wielded power and now must die for it would put Penelope in an absolute pickle, both politically and emotionally. So in terms of kind of the question of Act 1, Scene 1, how do you screw with Penelope? The answer seemed Clytemnestra. And then the logical follow-up of that and obviously Orestes and Electra are going to turn up, and that's going to be a massive geopolitical headache. So kind of the influence of the Oresteia sort of did the work for itself there. I can tell you about books 2 and 3, if you wish.
Well, was this always planned to be a trilogy? I ask because I secretly... Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, I found some article that called it a duology at one point.
Yeah, I don't know why. It's always been a trilogy. I just don't think the message got out there loud and clear early enough. It's always been a trilogy. Book 3 was finished before book 1 published.
Oh, wow.
I'm bored.
Well, that's a delight because it means we hopefully won't have to wait too long for books 2 and 3. I think that book 2 is coming out in August. I think I saw that.
I believe so, yes.
Yes.
The mild spoiler on that is it's not narrated by Hera. I hope you'll forgive me. It is in fact narrated by Aphrodite, who is the voice of Jonathan Van Ness from Queer Eye.
I love that.
I don't know how to write the voice of the goddess of love and desire, but I was watching Queer Eye because sometimes you just need televisual popcorn. And I realised that the goddess Aphrodite, of course, is walking up going, babe, did you row here yourself? I love it. You're giving me chin. You're giving me jaw. You're giving me, I burnt the topless towers of Ilium. It's fabulous.
I love that so much.
Yes, that is wonderful. Can you, I don't know if this is a spoiler too far, can you tell us who narrates book 3?
Athena.
It's fascinating. When I heard that there were going to be different narrators, my brain just went, obviously it's going to be Artemis and Athena, because those are the other two goddesses we meet in this book. But I'm so glad we get to see Aphrodite. I love her.
Again, on minor spoil level, book 2, fairly quickly, Helen of Troy becomes involved, which is why Aphrodite is immediately interested. Because again, Helen has a very different kind of female power. She has a sexiness that is both potent and yet immediately has to be diminished and dismissed. And Aphrodite, as a figure of female power, has to be immediately diminished and reduced, because how dare a woman have the power of desire and love? It's too threatening, it's too dangerous. So Aphrodite was in fact the logical choice for book 2. Although I cannot express my love for Artemis enough. I love everything about her, and just every time she appears on the page, I'm happy.
Oh, I think one of my favorite experiences reading this book was when Sarah texted me and goes, I think combing her hair is a euphemism for her getting eaten out. And I was like, I'm not there yet. Don't say anything.
I say nothing.
You don't have to. We're pretty sure we know what was going on.
It's not subtle.
No, but it's wonderful.
Oh, it was fantastic. And then Hera's just like, could you not? Delightful. Every time Hera, we got some of her more opinionated narration. I wrote it down in my list of quotes, and there was too many to include in this, but just know that they're there.
Thank you.
I just, I've said it before, but Hera's narration was so good. So good.
I was completely out of the loop because I don't do things like read summaries or anything before I read a book. Did not realize this was part of a series. And I got to the end and I was like, wow, this feels like a lot more of, not more Clytemnestra's story than Penelope's, but they really shared the limelight in a very fascinating way. And I was surprised that Odysseus didn't show up, but I liked that he didn't show up. And then I was like, oh, there's 2 more? All right, I guess I should just wait and see what happens. It is interesting how your impression of a narration changes from this is it to there's going to be much more story, even if it does sort of follow different characters. The story as a whole is not over yet, so I can't make any judgments. I gotta wait.
Yeah, I was like Lily. I was a little surprised that we didn't see really Odysseus at all.
We got a couple snippets of him.
The narrative problem about Odysseus is that his return has to shut down Penelope's story. Fundamentally, she is wielding power in his absence, and she's using his name to secure her safety. The second he turns up, there's no reason for her to have to do that, because he'll just wield the power. And so, again, minor spoiler, he may or may not be back. Homer has some things to say about that, but he won't be back for a while. When he does turn up, that logically changes the nature of the story. And to a certain extent, I think you could see that in Circe. I loved Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. I read Circe, and Circe, Odysseus is going to turn up at some point in the narrative. And the weight of that expectation, I thought, actually hung around the book for hundreds of pages. You're sort of waiting and waiting and waiting. And it's his name and his story has so much power that in many ways, I think it can almost distract from the power of the story being told, because you're reading about Circe's story, but you're sort of drumming your fingers going, but where's Odysseus? So I made quite a deliberate decision to minimize him as much as humanly possible, so that though there may still be this background sense of where's Odysseus, its relevance is one of, and how will this politically affect Penelope, rather than the kind of the millstone of, surely he's going to turn up, and then what to do?
I really loved how the glimpses we did get of him, some of it in sort of memories of Penelope and the other characters, and a few glimpses that Hera shares with us with him on the island with Calypso. His character is in a very gray area. We see that he valued Penelope for her social subtleties, but was also just as much of a dingus as the other heroes, and probably cheated on Penelope, but is maybe being sexually assaulted right now. Is Calypso a rapist? Not super clear in the text, where that falls in this version. And so I kind of felt bad that I was so invested in finding out what this version of Odysseus was going to be, because I was like, this isn't his story, Lily, stop.
I think it was quite important to leave him a big, giant question mark, not least because there is a great big narrative tension of he probably will maybe perhaps come back almost perhaps in book 3. And if you have a strong sense of is he a dingus or is he a lovely guy before that book, I think it undermines the narrative weight of that moment. Also, Penelope doesn't know. Like, if you look at the chronology around all of these stories, firstly, it makes no sense. Everyone's got to be in their 50s by the time Troy kicks off. Only they can't be, only they must be, only it doesn't make sense. None of the chronology makes sense. But if you look at it just geopolitically, in the Iliad, Odysseus, in one of his less brilliant moments, decides to pretend he's mad to not go to Troy by putting his baby son in front of a plough. Baby son implies they can't be married for that long unless they've had a prolonged period of not having a child, which is possible, but that's a different story. If you go just pure geopolitics and say, well, they've had one kid, they probably got it on fairly quickly because the point of political marriage is to have kids. They can't be going on for like more than a year, maybe 2, unless there is a big background here that we're missing. 2 years of marriage, tops, compared to 20 years of absence. You're going to be a bit vague.
That is very true.
I have so many questions, but I think I just have to wait for the books to come out.
I think we do just have to wait, which is going to be hard. Like, August is a long way from now.
Sorry. But also,
Well, now we can loop back to our conversation earlier about gender norms and how toxic masculinity ends up being bad for everybody. Because in this book, we see Orestes suffering so much because he can't express his grief because men aren't supposed to do that here.
Orestes and Telemachus are kind of the 2 counterpoints of the generation born after most of Troy has happened. And they're not quite born after Troy, but they're so young when Troy kicks off that they might as well be. Orestes has this massive weight of being Agamemnon's son. He's supposed to be power above all else. And power being a fundamentally masculine thing in this world, you're right, is not allowed to show any emotions whatsoever. Telemachus, on the other hand, has basically no power. He's got nothing going. And as a result, he sort of latches onto this poisonous sense of masculinity of what it is to be a warrior and stand with a shield and a spear, because it's the only way he can cling to even the slightest vestige of power. And so I think they both stand as kind of quite fun, traumatized young men, both desperately trying to find anything solid, anything to cling to in a world where on paper they should be at the top of the pecking order. And yet in reality, the structures into which they've been born have screwed them over so quickly at such formative ages that they're both really quite messed up young pups.
I was really hoping that Telemachus's friendship with Ketamon would help him a little bit instead of him deciding that now he's going to go off and do his own thing and not listen to Ketamon. Poor Ketamon.
Yeah. Again, some of that's Homer's fault. Homer is a little bit like, and then Telemachus did a bunk. And I wanted it to be justified and explained, but I also wanted to give Telemachus a chance. And he doesn't have a fatherly figure, and Ketamon is one of the least toxic fatherly figures available. So yeah, it was a little bit of a wrench sending off, but it also made sense.
I mean, it had to happen. Like, yes, yeah. It did make sense that it had to happen, but I was still sad.
I was a little bit sad because it doesn't bode well for his future character arc.
So you talked a little bit about bringing Clytemnestra and Electra and Orestes into the story to cause conflict, essentially, for Penelope. Is that basically why you brought them in? Because they don't really feature in the Odyssey as Homer wrote it.
Yeah, I looked at the Odyssey and went, my dude, where's your spin-off? Where's your downloadable content? Is it the Oristire? Yeah, I wanted to bring them in to bring conflict. And also, fundamentally, I was interested in writing essentially a geopolitical punch-up. When I initially went to Medra, I was like, picture Game of Thrones, but with sandals, which I thought was an amazing pitch, but it turns out sandals aren't that sexy.
Depends on the sandal.
It depends on who you ask, too.
Depends on whose foot it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to have this brimming sense of constant threat. Greece after Troy, there's no real leader anymore. Agamemnon's being topped. Menelaus is a cuckolded man and therefore questionable in his authority. And most of everyone else of any note is dead. So there's this massive power vacuum, and bringing in kind of the next generation and bringing the potential power and politics of that, I thought was a nice way of upping the stakes for the domestic conflict as well. It's not just that there's this emotional burden of, oh, damn, Clytemnestra's on this island. What the hell do we do? There's also this weight of how does Penelope defend herself against these big powers? And the obvious answer is get married. Everyone's going, you've got to get married, you've got to get married. And having this massive political threat just ups the ante, and you've got to get married. But obviously you've got to get married will also result in everyone dying a horrible death because, you know, the losers will definitely kill the winners. I just wanted to pile on more pressure, add to that cooker and keep on steaming.
Poor Penelope. I will say that the scene where Clytemnestra dies was one of the most heart-wrenching scenes in the book because of Hera's narration of it.
Thank you, and also sorry, and also yay, and also sorry. Hera was massively invested in Clytemnestra, which makes sense. A woman who wielded power. She's one of the last women in ancient Greece to ever wield power. And of course, Hera is besotted with the loss of power and the nature of power and the power that was and the power that will never be again. Yeah. It's also why Hera's not narrating book 2, because in a way, Hera's pain has sort of been covered.
I wouldn't call this book a mystery, but it does have mysteries. One of the things that was really delightful was sort of the tension of the drip of information that we get, and maybe not even realize that it's information until there's the reveal, and then like, oh yeah, that scene did happen, didn't it? How did you control at what points the audience finds out these sort of, I guess I'm mostly referring to Laenaria.
Yeah.
Laenera and Draymon, and that sort of whole thing, but also Clytemnestra being on the island is hinted at before we find out.
I fundamentally wanted the audience to find out at roughly the same pace as Penelope. Penelope is solving a mystery. She's trying to solve who is attacking my island, and she's trying to solve a murder mystery of why amongst the corpses is there this corpse that should not be there. And fundamentally, I wanted us to stick reasonably close to Penelope unraveling that, because I think it's satisfying and I think it's respectful to your reader. I'm not a skilled crime mystery writer in that sense, which sounds like I'm being falsely modest, but I mean it in the most sincere sense, in that true, skilled, expert crime mystery writers can have 1,000 red herrings and still make it work. I am much more procedurally A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. And so since the audience is getting the information in that order because Penelope is also trying to unravel it in that order, there's a certain whiff of mystery about it towards the end, in as much as the suitors are also oblivious to a lot of the information that's unraveling. And for much of Penelope's plan to work, secrecy needs to be kept. Secrecy is a big, strong theme of everything she does. And so in that sense, even when she has information, some of it may not be revealed because that's her whole power. And keeping that tight is what gives her strength.
Were there any scenes that surprised you as you were writing this book? Really, as you were writing the series as a whole?
Laertes, father of Odysseus, is the unsung most valuable player of the series. I was genuinely surprised by that. I was genuinely shocked. We don't see him that much in book 1, but when we do see him, he basically turns up and is like, what are you doing? This is stupid. And he's always right. He smells dreadful. He's covered in his own urine most of the time. The only things he really loves are his 2 pigs. But he's just unbelievably pragmatic. And though he never turns to Penelope and goes, I respect everything you do, fundamentally he is actually one of the very few men on the island who respects everything she does and lets her get on with it and isn't constantly there going, why aren't you getting married? He gets it and he lets her get on with it. And his response to calamity most of the time is, we will now hide in this ditch until it passes. And I was genuinely astonished to discover how much Laertes is the unsung MVP of a lot of this.
There is sort of a really wonderful counterpoint when you have like Telemachus, who feels the need to basically bring all of his friends to their bloody death just to make a point, versus Laertes, who has no qualms with hiding and just prefers to live another day. Like you said, pragmatic. I think, yeah, that's the right word. He's great.
He's very pragmatic and he's very done with heroes, because canonically Laertes in some tellings is an Argonaut. He sailed with Jason to get the Golden Fleece. And I think one of the questions you have to ask about him is, why is he not king? Like, in what circumstance does the father stand down and go, all right, son, you can have your go, and I'm going to retire to my pig farm? And I think the answer realistically has to be someone who's like, I don't really care about any of this nonsense. What's this ever done for me? And that leads you to a ruthlessly pragmatic guy who just wants to be left alone with his pigs. And yeah, I really warmed to him. Really warmed him over the series. He is ruthlessly just no nonsense.
I appreciated him asking for spikes when they rebuild his farm.
Yeah.
Yeah. A question mark. Is that going to be narratively relevant later? Can't say. Cannot say.
We'll find out.
Well, you mentioned not having a concretely defined process for writing, but how different would you say that the final product of Ithaca is from the first draft?
Not that different, in as much as I will spend most of my time when writing a book just thinking about it. There'll be a good few months of sitting in a corner with a notebook, doodling and thinking about what's going to happen. And then I'll sit down and I'll start writing. And within 10,000 words, my plan will not have survived first contact with the page. But I'll have a rough sense of where I'm going and kind of the necessary emotional beats to get there. How I get to the emotional beats will fluctuate based on what you encounter in the text. But the fundamental core moments of there must be this and there must be that, and then there's a vague 30,000 words in between them, will stay the same. And then I'll sit down and I'll write it straight through. And then I'll stop and then I'll do one read through to make sure there's nothing egregiously dreadful. And then I will usually send it to my editor with the classic heading, novel, as the subject line, and an email going, Dear Anna, attached is a novel, bye. Because again, after 20 something years of this, I trust my editor and I love her unconditionally. I think she's absolutely brilliant. I don't feel there's any value in me going, Dear my editor, I present to you this fascinating text, this glorious tome, this wonderful literary work for your consideration of perusal. She'll either like it or she won't. So she might as well just get a book called Novel! And she'll either like it or she won't. I am not a believer in trying to seek perfection in a text because there's no such thing. A text is fundamentally subjective. And the only person you're having a conversation with when you're editing alone is yourself. And fundamentally, books are not a conversation between you and your reflection. Books are a conversation between you and the world at large. You are attempting to communicate something outside. If you're not, you can write a diary. But if you're writing a novel for publication, you are part of a culture and a conversation. And in that sense, I don't feel the need to slave over draft after draft after draft without getting input from my editor, because she is good at her job, frankly. And if she turns around and says, I don't understand this and this doesn't make sense, even if I disagree with it, the fact that I have not achieved my intention of making that clear is my problem. And I will never know that by myself. So my first draft and my second draft tend to be fairly similar because there's only so much you can do solo. And I roughly know the beats. And I have reasonable confidence in well-constructed characters to get me there. And if they're not getting me there, then my beats are wrong. And I just need to fix that and discover that as I go along. All of this makes it sound like I am essentially throwing paint at the wall and seeing what sticks. I swear to God, there's probably some craft in there. Honestly, there's probably some craft in there, but I don't feel it as a constructed concept. I feel words as music and colour. I experience words synesthesically. I feel sentences as being a shade of lilac, and I feel chapters as being circular or squares or triangular. You can feel the physical weight of them. And I can feel text as a 3D object. And a lot of what I do is making the words pretty and the shapes nice.
Thank you so much for coming on to talk to us about Ithaca. As we've said, we absolutely adored this book, eagerly awaiting book 2. Is there anything you can tell us about any current projects you might be working on?
My editor would like me to say that my official stance is I'm currently working on book 3. That is a lie. Book 3 has been finished for ages, and I am a bit bored. However, I'm supposed to say I'm working on it to kind of really exude literary dedication. The reality is I'm writing space opera. Pew, pew, space lasers!
Ooh.
Pew, pew! For pure joy and fun, because I've never done it. I've done quite a lot of books, and I've never done space opera. And it's hard, man. So much world building. So I'm doing that. Yeah, that's my top secret project. I'm keeping the secrets so well.
Do you have just a list of genres, and every time you publish a book, you're like, got that one checked off?
Not really. I you know, what's the point of living if not to constantly be moving forward, I guess.
And in this case, literally very far forward. I guess not necessarily. Space opera could be in the past. I take it back.
Yeah, all bets are off, it turns out, with space opera, which can be a disadvantage.
Well, I, for one, look forward to reading this eventually. In the meantime, if people want to hear more about your books that are coming out, whether they're Ithaca, this trilogy, or very secret space opera that you haven't told anyone about, where can you be found on the internet?
I'm at clairenorth.com. I'm on Twitter as clairenorth42. I'm on Mastodon, as I also think of some version of clairenorth42. I'm still trying to work out how to make Mastodon work properly, because there's stuff about I'm on a UK server. That seems relevant.
Mastodon's a little weird.
Yeah, but Twitter's on fire, so I figured start moving the precious belongings over. Yeah, and sometimes I'm at book events in places, all of which I tend to put up on my blog.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
Thank you again so much for sharing your time with us today. It was so much fun to read this book and talk to you and just get us wound up for book 2.
Yay! Thank you so much for having me. I am honoured.
Thank you.
It was our pleasure. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Fiction Fans.
Come disagree with us. We are on Twitter and Instagram at FictionFansPod. You can also email us at fictionfanspod@gmail.com.
If you enjoyed the episode, please rate and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and follow us wherever your podcasts live.
Thanks again for listening, and may your villains always be defeated. Bye.
Bye.